Hello, and welcome to another episode of Such a Nightmare, Conversations about Horror. My name is Katherine Troyer, and joining me is Anthony Tresca.
Well, hi there.
This is a podcast devoted to thoughtful discussions about that fine line between the horrific and the horrible. Each episode looks at a specific horror text that is, for better or worse, giving us nightmares.
And we're so glad you decided to join us for our discussion today of 2015's A Head Full of Ghosts.
I particularly am excited because when I was advocating for us to occasionally deviate from the film text to other horror texts, it was in part because I wanted an opportunity to be able to talk about Head Full of Ghosts. And this is I think, terrific novel. We will discuss this. I think it's Paul Tremblay's best so far.
Yeah,
will disagree.
I actually think it's his worst, but I that doesn't mean I don't think it's good.
Yeah, no, I mean, when you have, I think the thing is that when you have an author like Tremblay has proven himself to be, his worst is still leagues above other people's best. And it's not worse as in, for you, it's not worse as in it's bad, it's just the other ones outrank it.
Yeah, it's just in my opinion, I prefer his other two novels over this one.
Yes, because neither of us have had a chance to read his novel. We will start where we always start, which is with our critical framework, and then we'll get into our discussion of this book, which hopefully you have had a chance to read by now, dear audience members.
And if not, you can always stick around. Maybe our discussion will encourage you to pick up a copy of the book.
Yes, although, I'm sure at some point there will be major spoilers.
Oh yeah, for sure. We're going to probably spoil the whole thing.
Anthony and I have talked about this before, that, if you look at the sheer amount of scholarship and even non-scholarship, just discussions about horror films, right? There's just so much out there. But if you look for stuff on horror fiction, unless you're talking about the classics, and I mean truly like Frankenstein, Dracula, Jekyll and Hyde, we're talking like the true classics, or Stephen King.
Yeah.
Right. You're just really not going to find a lot of scholarship out there on, or just even, again, sort of general discussions on horror fiction, which I think is a real pity, because some of the best stuff that's out there right now, I think, is actually fiction.
It's just so much easier to watch a movie than it is to sit down and have to read a full book.
It is, and it's easier to often write a 20-page article about a movie than it is to write it about a book, right? And there's lots of really, I think, obvious reasons.
Yeah.
But I would like to argue and advocate for more discussions about horror fiction, period. But particularly about Tremblay's Head Full of Ghosts. So there is one article that I know of, and I'm not saying there are not others, but there is one article that I think will allow us to have some interesting conversations about why this book works in a lot of respects, and maybe why it doesn't always work.
Do be warned, dear listeners. This article, though, is a bit, pardon the pun, heady. So just be warned.
Yes, it is. So this is an article called Horror After Theory, and After Theory is in quotation marks, by Lyle Enright. And it comes out of the Palgrave Handbook to Horror Literature. But as Anthony mentioned, this is a little bit more dense of an article, because essentially what Enright is arguing is that we have this renaissance of horror fiction that is coming out, and he also cites books like Mark Danielewski's House of Leaves, that also like Dan Simmons Druid, right, that are intentionally engaging not only with generic elements but with theory elements. And so his argument is that we have these texts, and he says Head Full of Ghosts definitely falls in here, that are really challenging our understanding of the genre as much as they are adding to the genre, and that one of the ways they're doing it is by having authors that are very cognizant of the scholarship. And of course, in Head Full of Ghosts, that comes out largely through the blog posts, right?
Yeah, and I think this kind of holds I think we're seeing a real turn towards this. It's like with the whole postmodernism type of movement, it's really hard to make content today without acknowledging the work that came before it, and thus all the tropes and pitfalls that have come before it as well, and all the baggage that comes with writing anything in genre.
Yes, and it's not surprising because nowadays, right, if you're going to have, say, for example, a zombie text, are you going to have this like multiple episodes and or like chapters where they're like, what are these things? I don't know, we've never ever seen something like it, and you, the reader, are like, they're zombies, hello, right? Or are you going to have a world where they're like, these are zombies, well, that's interesting, right? And it really is, it changes the dynamic of the world you're creating, of our understanding of the concepts. If you're going to go more postmodern, and we've talked about before in this podcast how that's not always my cup of tea, particularly in films like The Dead Don't Die, but then it's delightfully my cup of tea in other films such as Scream, right? So it really is, I think you're absolutely correct that we have to acknowledge that we are in a period that is aware of itself and that wants fiction, be that literature or film, that is also aware of itself.
I think it would be quite hard to sell modern contemporary audiences on the idea that nobody in the present day has heard of zombies, ghosts, possession narratives, which is what Head Full of Ghosts is all about. It's really hard to do that because they're so ingrained in the culture. Like those films and those books that have inspired this genre and brought them to the mainstream have to be acknowledged in the present, because you can't, unless you're writing in an alternate timeline in which there are no texts like The Exorcist or The Poltergeist or things like that, then you have to acknowledge that people are probably going to be aware of them and know at least something about it.
Yes. And we talked about this, right, very explicitly in our Exorcist episode, that the reason The Exorcist remains so important, even if it's not the film that Anthony and I are going to go to when we just want to watch a horror film, is because you can't exist in a world that doesn't acknowledge The Exorcist.
Right. It helped for all the bad that The Exorcist is, and I do think it is a lot of bad. And if you want full thoughts, go back and listen to our episode on The Exorcist.
Yes.
But I can't deny that The Exorcist did create a sort of language for possession narratives, specifically any possession narrative that features the element of religion. You can't deny that there's a specific language and a way that it operates that have kind of become universal.
And, it's interesting. So, Head Full of Ghosts was one of the books that we had the students read in our class on the home in American horror. Mm-hmm. And there were several students who said that at first they were really worried about reading this book because they were so very tired of the possession narrative. And they didn't want to read another book that dealt with the possession narrative. And then they were pleasantly not just surprised, but engaged with this text because they realized that it was aware of the strengths and weaknesses of that subgenre. It was aware of the tensions and the sort of things that make the genre rich, but also aware of the things that are problematic. And so that, to me, is right there one of the big selling points, is that, as Enright said, this is a text that is aware of itself and is sort of acknowledging, hey, I know everything that's happened, not just in terms of the genre, but also in terms of discussion about the genre. I'm going to incorporate that into something that is going to problematize this text.
And it does that in both a more of an abstract way in how it treats the characters and the situations, because most of the characters have a knowledge of it, but also in a very, very literal way. It deals with discussion and criticism of these types of medias and text, because it has a character that is a blogger specifically on horror text that allows it to kind of go in and make references and at least pay a little bit of lip service to these famous horror texts that clearly Paul Tremblay has talked about. They influenced him, they influenced the writing of this book.
Yes. And, it was interesting to see the sort of reader response, because there were students who admitted that, as they were reading the blog post, they were like, yep, nod, I understand where that reference is, ah, ha, ha, ha. And there were other students that said that they, their knowledge of the genre was not rich enough for them to be able to make every connection, but they nevertheless appreciated it's sort of being grounded, right, in this framework that again was both simulating what we wanted them to be doing in the class, which is critically thinking about it, but also just sort of that awareness of all that's happened before.
And I think by also acknowledging within the text itself that possession and exorcist type of narratives are a bit contrived and played out at this point, it allows you to not focus so much on that and on the actual possession narrative itself, but really more of how these specific characters are reacting to the possession narrative itself, because it's the text itself explicitly acknowledges that it's a bit played out and overdone at this point.
Yes. And I find it very interesting. If you look at the ratings, the reader ratings for this book on Goodreads, it's got a 3.8, which, when you look at the actual comments, a lot of the criticism is because I don't think they understood what Anthony says is, I think, made very explicit in the text. And that is that you'll read the reviews and it'll be things like, this was a familiar story that I've seen before, or this is the typical possession narrative. This has already been experienced in The Exorcist. And I'm not saying that this is a flawless book, because I'm not sure there's such a thing as a flawless text. But I think that you're right. That one of the big things that differentiates readers that really like this text versus ones that don't is their awareness of it as being a post-genre, post-theory text.
Yeah, I think this is something that when we talk about Tremblay more and his other texts, you'll see throughout all of his books is that he doesn't really care about writing a unique and original story, or coming up with that premise. Mm-hmm. He's more focused on the other things involved in creating a horror story, particularly one that is so postmodern, post-theory. And so he just wants to see how more normal people will react in these situations than we're often given in most horror texts, because in horror films and literature, it is typically assumed that they're going to be kind of stupid idiots who make dumb choices so that we can have the most effective scares possible. But in Tremblay's writing, he really crafts characters that feel really real, and thus juxtaposes that with this extreme crazy situation that we've seen played out before, and just forces you to be with them while they deal with it.
Yes, I think you're absolutely correct. And I think that that's a very smart move, because he's not just writing in a post-Stephen King world. He's writing in a post-Clive Barker, Ramsey Campbell, Jack Ketchum, Peter Straub, not to mention the Poe, Jackson, Matheson,
William Peter Blatty, who wrote The Exorcist.
Yeah, exactly. The list goes on. And so he, just as I think any possession narrative today really does need to acknowledge where it fits in this post-Exorcist world. He's writing in a time where we have a lot of really great horror that have already broken the grounds. Anybody who's I have an idea for a story that you've never heard before. It's about a girl who, has telekinetic powers that develop around the time of her period. No, once upon a time that was revolutionary. It is not anymore. And so we have Tremblay coming in and saying, like you said, what's interesting to me is not that I've reinvented the possession wheel. It's that I'm saying, okay, what do we do within this world if we already know this world or think that we do? And I want to bring in just one quote from Enright that I think really encapsulates, perhaps much more succinctly, what we are talking about as being, I think, one of the strengths of this text. And so he says, and this is a quote, "Each piece of evidence only makes the picture more complicated, not less. And though postmodern theory has often praised this kind of ambiguity, the legacy of the theory is here critiqued for offering diagnostic narratives which actually seek to explain rather than maintain the ambiguity." And then he goes on a little bit later to say, "For Tremblay, true horror resides in the ambiguity, which remains in Mary's memory, and in the indecision between the natural and the unnatural." And so to kind of break that down, because again, like I said, and like Anthony said, Enright's article is a little dense. Really, he's seen that, the postmodern genre has praised ambiguity as being this sort of be-all, end-all approach to things. And he argues that Tremblay sort of simultaneously celebrates that ambiguity while also saying that this might be the source of horror. That what might be disturbing is the fact that if we take Mary's memories, Mary's account during the moment, the video footage of the TV show, as well as Karen's blog, right? If we throw all of that together, things don't become simpler, they become more complicated, and that may or may not always be a good thing.
Yeah. And I mean, that's pretty much explicitly what Tremblay wants. He said in an interview that the ambiguity is just a huge part of his book, and it was such an intentional choice on his part. He wanted to, and I'm quoting him directly here, muddy the water as much as I could. And to do so, I put in as many filters and perspectives on Mary's reality as I could.
Yeah, that's a lovely quote. I feel, I'm not sure, I don't have a good way to segue into this. I just feel it's so important to like shout out that Tremblay is a mathematician, right? That's
true.
His background. And it's interesting that in a world where you're taught that ambiguity is not something that's necessary, right? So much of math is about certainty, although not advanced math, but so much about like how we understand math is about certainty. And then he says, but I want it to be just completely open for this like muddying of waters. I just want to like praise him for being amazing.
Yeah, Tremblay's a bit of a weird dude. He's done quite a bit. He got, like you said, he got his master's degree in mathematics. Then he worked at factories for a little while in the warehouses and on assembly lines. And then he taught high school math and coached basketball for a bit. And all the while he was just kind of writing these short stories. And then eventually he got to where he is today, where he is a full-blown horror author. But he's just had a very interesting life. He hasn't been tied to any one thing. Many strands are in his life, and he's tried to follow them all at least a little bit.
When you read the author notes that he often provides, I feel like you can see that, right? Because he has some very like methodical ways that he engages with his texts, things that he's very specifically hoping to do. He often sets for himself almost a sort of like mental puzzle that he has to work himself out of.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that ends up being very rewarding in any text, and I think Head Full of Ghosts is no exception.
And it also because he includes what we're referring to is in most copies of the books. There's like extended liner notes that he has on everything, and just it also shows that he's done so much research behind pretty much every choice that is made. He has a reason for it. He didn't just choose a name. The name was chosen for a very specific reason because it had a specific influence. Like Rachel Neville was named after two people. Robert Neville, the last person alive, the protagonist in I Am Legend, and then also was named after the excellent British horror writer Adam Neville. So that name, could just have been anything. It could have just as easily been Jamie Smith, and it would have worked fine. But it has a very, very specific and thorough reason behind it.
Yes. To go back to that criticism that's often leveled at him that this feels very familiar, I think that, he wants it to feel very familiar, from names that you're like, haven't I heard that before? I feel like that's a name of a character, to just the basic premise. He's intentionally, or at least the narratives can be read as intentionally creating this space for us to bring in all of our prior knowledge as an advantage, right? Oftentimes when we read a book, we're asked to temporarily not be reminded of anything else that exists.
Yes, that's suspension of disbelief.
Yes.
And he doesn't ask you to suspend any disbelief.
No, in fact, he asks you as much as possible to bring in all of the knowledge that you have prior, all of the sort of mindsets and viewpoints that you have, because that's where the text becomes more complicated.
Yeah, and to question everything he's telling you, everything that is being set up. He wants you to challenge and be like, and not just suspend your disbelief and go along with him because that's easier and that'll make it easier for him to write his story and for you to just get done with it if you just like go along with him. No, he wants you to be like, well, does that make sense? Is this another instance of our narrator being unreliable, or can we actually trust her on this?
Yes, and that idea of the unreliable narrator is so powerfully done in this book. So just as a reminder for those of you that aren't using your 12th grade English lessons a lot, an unreliable narrator is a narrator that for whatever reason we can't trust. And as Anthony pointed out to me when we were just kind of talking through the idea of the unreliable narrator, we have a lot of examples of real people that we know are unreliable narrators. And I think one thing that's really important to keep in mind is that we can never entirely trust any author or storyteller, because by bent they are telling stories, and they will tell you a story about the significance of something that in reality just kind of came to them in the moment. And so Edgar Allan Poe was your example.
Yeah, he's a classic liar. He lied about everything. It made it so impossible to write biographies about him, because anytime anyone would ask him a question, he would just say whatever came into his head.
And sometimes, so I remember Stephen King in an interview once said something like, I used to tell people X because it sounded more mysterious or more whatever, and then he's like, but the truth is, right? And it's just, you're going to build
Robert Pattinson does the same thing.
Exactly. And so if you look at like a quick Wikipedia search for unreliable narrator, what's really interesting is the number of their examples that has a narrator who is unreliable because of mental illness. And so they mentioned The Telltale Heart, they mentioned The Yellow Wallpaper, they mentioned the TV show Legion, the TV show You, right? So all of those are examples of people that we know are unreliable because they're mentally unstable. One of the ones they mentioned that I think is worth bringing up is, because it's not an obvious one, because it's not obviously mentally unstable, is the Ted Mosby narrator of How I Met Your Mother. There's a lot of discussion about the fact that we have to understand that he's telling a story to his children, so it is going to be biased, right?
Oh yeah.
And anyway, so in Head Full of
Funny thing about How I Met Your Mother, though, is you'd think if Ted Mosby is telling the story to his children, he would make himself come off better, because he comes off as such a jerk.
See, but I think
the worst.
So, super quick aside, I actually think that that he does paint himself out to be better, right? Because certainly better than, one of the biggest issues I have with that show is the Barney Robin conclusion, right? The way it wraps up. And I was reading something the other day that was talking about the fact that if we keep in mind that Ted Mosby is going to tell a version of his past that makes it so that his children are okay with him getting with Robin, spoiler alert, that he's going to want to paint Barney in a more negative light, right? So he's going to be even more of a womanizer and even more of a whatever. So I feel like if he's painting himself as the opposite of Barney. Anyway,
It was an interesting aside.
So anyway, what I was going to say for Head
Coming soon, our How I Met Your Mother retrospective podcast.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure we can make it fit under conversations about horror. I'm sure we can make that work. But what I was going to say for Head Full of Ghosts is that it employs my absolute favorite of favorites, literary sort of tropes, and that is, and it does it multiple times over, and that is the story within a story. I'm just such a sucker for that. And we have Mary's account, but we have to remember that it is Mary's account as an adult that she is telling to a news person.
Yeah, an interviewer.
Yes, and so we have to keep that in mind, but we don't always remember that, right? Because when we're in Mary's childhood, we're kind of in that sort of in the moment. Then we have Karen's blog, which we have to realize is also really Mary, right? Reflecting on this. And then
But not just reflecting on the event, really more of reflecting on the televised version of the event.
Which is our other major modality, right? That we have this story that has been crafted into a mini-series. And so we have to understand that anything that's happening while they're filming is being edited accordingly.
For maximum entertainment value.
Exactly. And I just have to say that I just find that to be such a clever way to build an unreliable narrator, because what we realize is that, first off, she's not, I don't think intentionally, Mary's not intentionally being unreliable, right? She's not purposefully lying or trying to trick the audience. But I also think that we have to assume that we're never going to know the truth, because Mary doesn't understand the truth. She can't reflect back on what's happening. It's not even that she's saying this is the version of things that I know. It's here's a version of things that I know, but here's another version.
Because also she was so young at the time, and it was such a traumatic event that you combine those two things, and those two things alone are enough to muddy the waters and make you unsure of what happened, because there's a bunch of traumatic things and you're already young and have a hard time remembering. But then filter in on top of that, there is a version of what happened to you in the public zeitgeist that everyone knows, because apparently this TV show is very popular. And so that is what has been told to you and presented to you as your life, your entire life as well. And so it's only natural that she's kind of confused as to what is the truth and what actually did happen.
Exactly. I mean, I think all of us have those memories that we don't entirely remember on our own, right? But that have been told to us so many times that we feel we know it. How much more complicated would it get if it's not just your mom telling you, like, once upon a time you were little and this is what happened, but it's actually like, let's watch the DVD special edition of your childhood, right? During this most traumatic of times. And there's just something really sophisticated in how Tremblay weaves back and forth those different perspectives and creates an ambiguity that I'm okay with. And, Anthony really knows this, but I feel like, listeners, you've probably picked up on the fact that I'm not normally a big fan of ambiguity, because I think oftentimes it's, I'm going to say it, this is going to sound really harsh, but it's author laziness, right? It's the or if not laziness, then inability or unwillingness to commit, right? Like, reach in the bag, pull out which thing you find most disturbing, and there it is. I don't think that's what Tremblay's doing here. I think he's saying, here's what's most disturbing, that this sense of ambiguity, and it doesn't matter which way you read this story, at the end, we have broken people and a broken family and a broken world.
Well, I mean, I think this is a kind of memory horror. In that, one of the most disturbing things is that you can't trust your own memory, and that things that you remember to be true turn out to not be quite as true as you remember, or just never happened. But because they've been told to you so many times, they're in your head.
Yes.
And so it kind of falls into the camp of memory horror in that regard, which I don't think is the same thing as being just like we've talked about it with Us, of being just overly ambiguous grab bag horror. But that's not what this is. The ambiguity is more plays into the memory horror that this book is.
Yes. And, it's big things, right? Like, so that memory that you can't entirely remember might be the difference of, were you wearing a yellow shirt or a green shirt, or were you the instigator or the victim in a fight? This is, my sister was either possessed or pretending to be possessed. My sister either killed the family, or, it was an accident, or I killed the family, right? And there's so much at work. But I think you're spot on that what we realize is that what is less important in this case is which conclusion we arrive at, because no matter what, we're not allowed to arrive at it with total certainty. And how disturbing is that, to have that sort of realization that on big issues, fundamental issues, we'll never be able to know for sure which was the truth.
And I think that this is a problem that is larger than just the individual characters in the text. I think in a society like ours that is so fact-based, and we have the internet, so we can just Google everything and have things proved certain for us, that it's very scary when we can't say for certainty what has happened. And I think that is one of the elements that is certainly at play here. In a culture that's kind of obsessed with facts and quickness and readiness of information, not being able to have a clear, definitive answer is quite alarming.
And he gives us some modes, right, that should feel very definitive, such as a TV show that has been edited together that involved a whole crew, such as a blog post that is clearly grounded in theory, and isn't theory like truth, right?
Very researched, yeah.
And so you're absolutely correct. One of the interesting things that I think emerges out of people's responses and feelings about the book, particularly as a text that is about the home and horror, is that there were some people that really felt like it was less about horror in the home and more about sort of a critique of American culture and sort of the psyche of a mentally ill girl within that culture. And to me, again, I think that what Head Full of Ghosts does is it creates an both and, right? Instead of it being this is either this or it's that, it's constantly saying that it's all of this together. And when we throw all of these layers in, right, to go back to what you said, Tremblay says it murkies the waters, because we can't separate a possession narrative from the illnesses of the larger society, from the anxieties and fears. And I think that's kind of what this book does. It is its best, is that it refuses to let us untangle things that we so desperately want to untangle.
And I think this is a book that is, at least for me, it was not immediately satisfying upon completing it. And I think it is because of the ambiguity, because of that desire to kind of, you want an answer of some sorts as to like, either flat out don't believe this person or do believe this person, at least parts of it, because they can be kind of trusted. It never gives you that. It gives you a kind of, I don't know. Can we ever really know? That's frustrating because you want answers. But the more you think about it, or at least for me, the more satisfying that's been, because it is exactly what you were just talking about. It's more reflective of how things actually happen in the real world, and it's scary to not know.
Yes. And to make a sort of comparison back to films, I've read horror fiction that is the equivalent of a jump scare, right? In the moment you're like, ooh, that's a scary image. Or maybe even like you're reading the book and it's late at night and a door closes and you're like, I thought I was alone, right? But then when you put it down, it's that was an experience. This is a book that's the opposite. It grabs hold of your brain, and it's hours, days, weeks later, and you're finding yourself asking the dark questions and the deep questions about what am I supposed to believe, and how am I ever supposed to know it, especially in a world that is now giving me more and more versions of the story, right?
Yeah. Now, that's not to say that I think all of the ambiguity works. I think it goes too far, particularly at the end with the weird little, you said something like jump scares, but in books, I think that is essentially what happens at the end when there's that breath of air at the end, right at the end of the novel, and you're like, okay, whatever. Please just end the book already.
So if you read Tremblay's sort of notes right on here, he talks about the fact that the final sentence of the book, which is, after an awkward silence and after Rachel and I say our goodbyes again, it's cold enough that my breath is a visible mist. That he wanted to pay homage to The Thing, and to that sort of ambiguity there at the end of the film, The Thing, where you're not sure if any of the characters are human anymore. And so we get this moment where we have to ask ourselves, is it possible that Mary is possessed and has always been possessed, or that she became possessed later, right? And I think you're right. I think that, earlier I said that we can't say this is a flawless book, because I'm not sure there is such a thing. I would say that's the point where, and I don't know if it means cutting that last last chapter or the last paragraph. But I think you're right that this was his grab bag moment, right? The reason that this doesn't work is because this was the like, okay, reach in the bag. Do you want her to be possessed or not? And I think that is trying to, you know, give audience a potential to have their cake and eat it too. Whereas every other moment of ambiguity is more, you know, it doesn't matter.
And also that dumbs it down to either it's a 50%. Either she is possessed and everything that she said is a lie, or she isn't possessed and the things that have come before it aren't lies. They're not conscious lies. It really dumbs it down, whereas so much of the rest of the book has been, there's a million different ways this can go. But with that final choice, it kind of negates everything that's come before it in a single paragraph. It undermines the complexities of the entire book and the multiple certainties and uncertainties that are presented to you. With that, it's like, nope, it's just one or the other. She either was possessed or wasn't, and that really does affect the entire book now. And so I think that's another reason that immediately upon finishing this book, I wasn't as immediately like, wow, that was great, because I was so frustrated by the ending and how it undermined itself and everything that it had done before.
It's a very insightful comment, because I think you're right that one of the strengths of this book is that it never lets us think for a minute that either or is the way things work. That it really is like a little bit of this and a touch of that and a smidgen of that. Because, you know, like you said, it's not, is Mary lying or is she not? It's, does Mary understand things? Well, it depends on which context and which situation. And sometimes she's maybe preserving, right? And I think you're right that ending forces us back into this either or paradigm that the whole book has spent the whole time deconstructing.
Yeah.
And I think you're also right that this is a book that only becomes powerful upon completion. I know a lot of people, I had a friend who told me that for the first like 75 to 90% of the book, he was like, I have no idea why you recommended this. It's fine. It's just not great. And then he finished it and he was like, there it is. Right. And I think that that's a big gamble, and you can ruin it in a few sentences. And I don't think he completely ruined it, but I think that, you know, this is a real criticism, is that you cannot, horror people, you cannot give us this grab bag. That's not going to make your film, your story, your novel stronger. Ambiguity does, but not this grab bag approach.
Mm-hmm. And so for me, how I kind of deal with it is pretend that last line doesn't matter. I just kind of, I know that is not the best way to deal with it, but I just kind of choose to ignore it and be like, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter that we could see the breath for any number of reasons. I don't want to just think it's as simple as what even Paul Tremblay says it is, where it's like, is she possessed or isn't she? That I don't care.
Yes. and I do something kind of similar. I think of it almost as like an alternate scene that I've chosen to not.
It's from the director's cut.
It is. And actually, you know, but I think it really is. This is something that Tremblay wanted to get in as one more wink or nod. And I'm not sure that it was successful in a way that nearly everything else in this book was. I do think that what's nice is that he did weave in some moments that are sort of in the moment a little scary, right? I always think about that scene where Marjorie may or may not be in the room with Mary at night and in the like doll house, kid's house. And so again, I think that for the most part, this book manages to really do a good job of playing with that. I also just want to point out that some of the most thoughtful discussions I felt like in the entire class in Home and Horror stemmed from this book. And stemmed from this book because it allowed people to raise questions such as, what are we supposed to do about a patriarchal system in which the patriarchy is not only disenfranchised, but also perhaps incompetent? What are we supposed to do about parental neglect and who defines what is parental neglect? Is the father being neglectful, or is the mother being neglectful, or is it both? What are we supposed to do about a religion that has been a foundational component of our understanding of possession narratives that may be not that far removed from our definition of religions that we find very dangerous and threatening. And then, of course, what do we do with, I think it's so important, so important that Marjorie, she is at the cusp of many things. She may have some mental illness, but she's also just a teenage girl. And we've talked before about this idea of the grotesque and the unruly, right? And so much of this book is maybe she just has a bad personality right now. Maybe she's just hormonal, or maybe she's mentally ill, or maybe she's possessed. And this goes back again to what you said, Anthony, that I think you can read it as it's not 50-50. It's, well, in this moment, it may have been this. In this moment, it may have been that. Or all of the above or none of the above. And that's really, I don't know, this would have, I felt like, have been a really challenging book to write as well as Tremblay did.
I have one more slight problem with the text, particularly in terms of the structure. And I know you talked about earlier how much you enjoyed the multiple levels of how the story is told, because it is an interview, but it also weaves in blog posts, but it also weaves in scenes from the television show, but it also weaves in scenes from her memory. And that's a lot of things to do. And it sometimes gets lost. And I wish that maybe there had been more usage of the blog posts in particular, because they really only seem to be there for exposition dumps, which seemed like a bit of a waste of what they could have been, which I think if they had been sprinkled more throughout the text, they wouldn't have felt like, oh, I see what this is doing. It's just a place for them to do an exposition dump, but do it in a bit of a cheeky way. Okay, I got it. Whereas the way it's used now, and that's all it is.
I agree. I with the second part of what you said, I agree that we did need more blog posts, in part because I think you're right, that there was a missed potential in terms of that perspective we could have been offered. And that perspective is that as a scholar, right, we're so often required to take a stance that we cannot entirely. And so I think you're right that would have been a great opportunity. I do think, though, that what we didn't want to have happen is very obvious segmentations, where it's okay, and now we're having Karen, and now we're having transcript from the show, because I think that one of the things this novel does very effectively is that by the end we can't entirely remember which version gave us which information.
I agree with that, and that's why I think I would have liked to see more usage of the various media forms sprinkled throughout, because for a vast majority of this book, it is just her memory of what happened being told in a pretty standard narrative form, and we are led to believe that this is being filtered through her conversations with the interviewer, but that's not really super apparent unless you are right at the beginning of the parts where it's like, I was talking to Rachel for a second, and then you get back into the narrative flow. But for the vast majority of it, it's just operating under the standard lens of, this is a narrative possession book. And I would have liked more of the alternate media sources telling us more of what happened, more blog posts, more things from the television show, more of Rachel, the interviewer's thoughts on what is happening and her experience, because we're also led to believe that she has had some experience with the Possession TV show, and that's why she's writing this article about it. And so she comes with her own memory of what's happened, and so she could have brought in some pushback to certain parts that she's remembering and being like, I remember it this way, actually. I saw it on the television show.
No, you were very correct, and what you were saying actually speaks to one of my big concerns, and that is that this story has been optioned for a film adaptation.
Yes.
And to be perfectly honest, I think that everything that makes this book perfect, flawed but perfect, as a text to really explore what I think horror does at its best, I'm not sure that's going to be able to be communicated in a film. I think it could be done in a TV show where we could alternate between, like, episodes that are, or a limited series where we could alternate between episodes that are entirely the filmed version of the possession as though we were watching it as viewers, and then episodes where we're in the story as though we're Mary. Like, I think it could work in a limited series or something like that, but I don't know if the reason that the moment I finished this book, I felt the need to talk about it, which is, to me, a sign of a good book, because I read lots of books that I don't feel the need to ever share with people.
Right.
But, like, I had to, like, spill forth all my ideas immediately. I'm not entirely sure that's going to be able to be replicated in film form, not in a traditional Hollywood film form.
Yeah.
And that kind of devastates me.
Focus Features certainly has their work cut out for them. I think the only way you could really do it is if it's really hyper stylized and you acknowledge that you're cutting in between different various mediums, and that is just like a conscious choice that's being done.
And I just can't see that being the route that most major film studios, including Focus, are going to choose to do. I think it's going to be the story of Mary as a kid, and then, maybe if we're lucky, we'll have a moment of ambiguity. But
I think they're going to streamline it. They're going to streamline it a lot. And
in reality, right, we're supposed to walk away realizing that we have our own head full of ghosts. And I think that, a film version is going to be head full of ghost, right? Like, I just think it's going to have
the one.
To, like,
it's like, that's it.
Mm-hmm. Up next is going to be a continuation of the Tremblay train. In our next episode, we are going to be looking at the cabin at the end of the world.
And we're not just going to be talking about the cabin at the end of the world. We are also going to be doing a comparison to a film. We're going to be talking. Yeah, it's a bit of a comparative text kind of episode. We're going to be talking about Darren Aronofsky's film Mother.
For those of you that have already read the book and seen the film, and you're asking yourself why, you'll have to just listen to our next episode. For those of you that haven't read the book or watched the film yet, please do so for our next episode, where we're going to do our very first comparative analysis, and we're very excited about that.
In the meantime, be sure to share our podcast with others, either digitally or with your friends, and be sure to give us a like and leave us a comment if you can. It really helps wherever you get your podcasts. Just tell us we're doing a good job, or give us some honest feedback. Listen, we'll take it.
Yes,
got thick skin.
And in the meantime, thank you so very much.
Thank you.